Hey all, Aurora here with some incredible true stories of father-in-law's sporting bad behavior. My first story is something you won't believe happened at the rehearsal dinner. The evening had begun with a sense of enchantment and high spirits as we gathered to celebrate Emma and David's imminent nuptials. The bride's parents had spared no expense, securing the most opulent private room at the city's premier restaurant. It was an atmosphere of sophistication and joy, with glasses clinking and laughter filling the air, completely oblivious to the impending catastrophe. David's father, Jack, was notorious for his flirtatious tendencies, and with the libations flowing freely, he was in rare form. He seemed magnetically drawn to Emma, who was radiant with pre-wedding excitement. Initially, it appeared he was merely offering his congratulations, but then his hand slid around her waist, pulling her close, and he whispered something into her ear that made her stiffen in discomfort. I wasn't the only one who noticed this egregious behavior. Ryan, the best man and David's closest confidant, was observing the scene with a vigilant eye. Recognizing the impropriety, he swiftly intervened, inserting himself between Jack and Emma. The look on Ryan's face was one of incandescent rage as he demanded Jack step back. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the previously festive atmosphere now thick with tension. Jack, never one to retreat from a confrontation, began spewing venomous insults at Ryan, goading him. The tension escalated rapidly, culminating in a single decisive moment. Ryan's fist flew with lightning speed, connecting with Jack's jaw in a resounding crack that echoed through the room. Jack crumpled to the floor, clutching his face in shock and pain. Gasps of astonishment rippled through the assembled guests as they struggled to process the scene before them. Emma's eyes brimmed with tears, her dream evening shattered in an instant. David, who missed the initial events leading up to the punch, was caught between protecting his bride and confronting his father. He rushed over to restrain Ryan, while Emma's family tended to the fallen Jack, who was now sporting a grotesquely swollen jaw and a nasty split lip. After a quick catch-up, David's face was a portrait of fury and humiliation as he demanded his father leave the premises immediately. Jack, now a picture of abject defeat, mumbled a barely coherent apology as he stumbled out of the room, leaving a trail of disgrace in his wake. The once joyous evening had descended into utter chaos, the guests slowly dispersing in a haze of shock and dismay. What should have been a celebration of love and union had been marred by scandal and violence, transforming into a cautionary tale of unbridled impropriety and the devastating consequences of crossing boundaries. As the dust settled and whispers of the evening's events spread among the guests, it became painfully clear that this rehearsal dinner would be remembered not for its elegance or the promise of the upcoming wedding, but for the salacious drama that unfolded, forever tainting the memory of what should have been a night of pure joy. For those interested, the wedding was perfect, and Jack was nowhere in sight. Next is definitely one of the top 5 craziest wedding dramas I have ever encountered. It started out perfectly. The ceremony was taking place at a beautiful old chapel, beautifully decorated with flowers and candles. The bride, Anna, was stunning in her white gown, practically floating down the aisle to meet her groom, Mark. Everything was perfect, that is, until her father showed up. Anna's dad, Richard, had always been a bit of a wild card. He was charming and gregarious, but had a notorious reputation for his impulsive decisions and dubious taste in women. Still, no one was prepared for the spectacle he caused on his daughter's big day. The ceremony was just about to begin when Richard burst through the doors, fashionably late as always. But he wasn't alone. On his arm was this woman, Candy, or at least that's what she said her name was. She looked like she'd stepped straight out of a nightclub, with a dress so tight and low-cut that it left little to the imagination. Everyone's jaws practically hit the floor. The entire congregation turned to stare as Richard led her up the aisle, right to the front where Anna and Mark were standing, looking bewildered and horrified. You could cut the tension with a knife. As if the situation wasn't already awkward enough, Richard cleared his throat and announced to everyone that he had some exciting news. He wanted to marry Candy right there and then at the same ceremony. A surprise double wedding. The place erupted in gasps and murmurs. Anna's face turned ghostly pale, her big day suddenly overshadowed by her father's outrageous announcement. The officiant, a kindly old reverend, looked like he didn't know what to do. He glanced around, clearly hoping someone would intervene. Anna's mother, a dignified woman named Margaret, was on the verge of tears. She'd been divorced from Richard for years, but even she didn't deserve this humiliation. Anna's bridesmaids, all dressed in pale lavender, stood frozen, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Mark's groomsmen shifted uncomfortably, exchanging bewildered glances. It was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. Richard, completely oblivious to the chaos he was causing, started going on about how he and Candy were soulmates, destined to be together forever. He rambled about fate and true love, as if this was some grand romantic gesture instead of an appalling intrusion. Richard, always the thinker, announced to the guests that they were not to worry, as he'd have his Venmo account details available at the reception for wedding gifts for himself and Candy. The guests were in shock, some looking away in embarrassment, others whispering furiously amongst themselves. Anna finally found her voice, but it was shaky and strained. She told her father this was her wedding day and that it wasn't the time or place for his spontaneous marriage plans. Richard just laughed it off, saying it would be fun to have a double wedding. Anna looked like she was about to faint. At this point, Mark stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. He was clearly angry, but was doing his best to remain calm. He put his arm around Anna, shielding her from the escalating spectacle. You could see the conflict on his face. He wanted to throw Richard and Candy out, but he also didn't want to make the situation worse. Richard, however, was relentless. He turned to the Reverend, practically demanding that he proceed with a double ceremony. The Reverend stammered, trying to maintain some semblance of decorum. The whole thing was descending into farce. Then, out of nowhere, Candy piped up, saying how she'd always dreamed of getting married in a beautiful place like this. Her voice was high-pitched and grating, and it only made the situation feel even more surreal. You could hear the disbelief ripple through the crowd. At this point, Margaret had had enough. She stood up from her seat in the front row, a look of fierce determination on her face. She marched up to Richard and demanded he leave. The guests held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Richard, for the first time, looked a bit taken aback. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by his ex-wife. But Margaret was not backing down. She told him he was ruining Anna's wedding, and that if he had any respect for his daughter, he'd take Candy and leave immediately. For a moment it seemed like Richard might argue, but then he looked around and saw the glares and shaking heads from the guests, the pleading look in Anna's eyes and the stern resolve on Margaret's face. Slowly, realization dawned on him that he'd overstepped massively. Richard mumbled something about just wanting to share his happiness, but Margaret wasn't having any of it. She took Candy by the arm and steered her towards the door. Richard, looking defeated and embarrassed, followed them out. As the doors closed behind them, you could almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the guests. The ceremony resumed, but the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. Anna tried to put on a brave face, but you could see the hurt and embarrassment lingering. Mark did his best to comfort her, and eventually they managed to exchange their vows, though the shadow of Richard's stunt loomed large over the proceedings. Afterwards, at the reception, everyone was buzzing about the incident. It was the scandal of the year, a story that would be retold at every family gathering for decades. Richard's antics had turned what should have been a perfect day into a spectacle, leaving a bitter taste in everyone's mouth. The whole event was a stark reminder of how one person's selfishness can derail even the most carefully planned occasions. Anna and Mark tried to make the best of it, but it was clear that the memory of their wedding would always be tainted by Richard's outrageous behavior. It was a dramatic, salacious fiasco that no one present would ever forget. And finally, one of the all-time craziest wedding disgraces I've ever witnessed. It unfolded at Sarah and Michael's wedding. What began as a day of elegance and joy descended into a dramatic tableau of disgrace, largely due to the reprehensible behavior of Sarah's father, Jonathan. The wedding was held at a grand estate, an opulent venue with sprawling gardens and a beautifully decorated reception hall. Sarah, radiant in her stunning gown, and Michael, dashing in his tailored suit, seemed the epitome of a perfect couple. Their families and friends gathered to celebrate their union, the air filled with an aura of happiness and anticipation. The ceremony was flawless, a moving exchange of vows that left many in tears. But as the festivities shifted to the reception, Jonathan's notorious appetite for scandalous behavior began to surface. Jonathan had always been known for his roguish charm, but what transpired that evening surpassed even his most infamous escapades. The reception was in full swing, with laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses resonating through the hall. Amidst the revelry, Jonathan's behavior quickly turned inappropriate. He began by targeting the bridesmaids, whose elegant dresses and cheerful demeanor did little to shield them from his lecherous advances. His compliments, though wrapped in seemingly benign words, grew increasingly suggestive, his hands lingering too long in places they had no business being. Elaine, his wife, initially tried to maintain her composure. She was a woman of impeccable grace and dignity, well accustomed to her husband's antics, but clearly mortified by his brazenness on this significant occasion. As Jonathan's behavior escalated, moving from the bridesmaids to the female guests, the atmosphere started to shift. His advances became more blatant, his comments more audacious, as he ignored the disapproving glances and whispered criticisms that began to spread through the crowd. Jonathan did not stop there. He turned his attention to the female servers, whose professional demeanor did little to deter him. His actions were shockingly brazen, with his hands and words leaving a trail of discomfort and indignation in their wake. The entire reception was soon abuzz with murmurs of his inappropriate conduct, the once joyous celebration tainted by his disgraceful behavior. Elaine's face grew taut with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Her attempts to steer him back to some semblance of decorum were met with dismissive laughter. Sarah, too busy with her guests to initially notice, eventually caught sight of the debacle unfolding around her father. Her expression of horror and disbelief was palpable, her dream wedding day beginning to unravel. Then came the climax of Jonathan's appalling behavior. As the night wore on and the tension in the room thickened, Jonathan decided to make an announcement. Stumbling towards the band, he grabbed the microphone and called for attention, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. With Elaine by his side, looking both bewildered and apprehensive, he began to speak. What everyone expected to be a heartfelt toast or a moment of paternal pride turned into something far more shocking. Jonathan declared, with a self-satisfied smirk, that he wanted a divorce. The room collectively gasped, the atmosphere electric with shock. But he wasn't finished. Jonathan went on to reveal that he had gotten his best friend's 18-year-old daughter pregnant and that they planned to marry. The room descended into chaos. The guests were in stunned silence, unable to fathom the depths of Jonathan's audacity. Elaine's face turned pale, the composed facade she had maintained all evening crumbling in an instant. The young girl in question, who had been seated with her parents, looked mortified, her face a portrait of fear and shame. Jonathan, seemingly oblivious to the devastation he had caused, stood with a look of triumph. He appeared to revel in the shock and horror that rippled through the room. Sarah was beside herself, her eyes brimming with tears as the reality of her father's betrayal and the public humiliation settled in. Michael, standing protectively by her side, looked as though he could barely contain his fury. As the announcement sank in, some guests began to leave, unwilling to remain part of the scandalous spectacle. The joyous celebration had irrevocably transformed into a nightmare, a cautionary tale of betrayal and impropriety. Elaine, her dignity hanging by a thread, finally turned and walked away from Jonathan without a word. Her back straight despite the turmoil within, Sarah rushed to her mother, her heart breaking for the woman who had been humiliated so publicly. Michael tried to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. Jonathan's scandalous revelation had cast a dark shadow over the entire event, transforming what should have been a cherished memory into an infamous debacle. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire among the guests and beyond. Jonathan's fall from grace was complete, his actions condemned by all who heard of them. Elaine, with her dignity intact despite the ordeal, began to move on from the debacle, supported by her family and friends. Sarah and Michael, though their wedding day had been marred, found solace in each other and the love of their close ones. This wedding, meant to be a celebration of love and unity, instead became a legendary tale of disgrace, a dramatic reminder of how one man's selfishness and recklessness can overshadow even the brightest of days. The fallout was immense, with relationships strained and reputations ruined, leaving a lingering sense of betrayal and sorrow in its wake. Thank you for listening. If you found these stories to be entertaining or have a story you would like to share, please leave a comment below and like and subscribe so you never miss a new story. Check out these videos in our Wedding Tales and Fails series. Bye for now.